I want to start by saying I'm not the kind of person who makes stupid decisions. I mean, I know everyone says that. Every person who ever walked into a disaster zone with a press badge and a protein bar in their pocket says that same thing before they describe the worst night of their life. But I genuinely wasn't reckless. I was careful. I had been careful for 11 years, covering wars, diplomatic crises, 3 alien first contact events, and one very memorable incident involving a rogue terraforming drone on the moon colony of Kepler-9. I had survived all of those things by being the kind of journalist who asked questions before walking through doors. And then I got the invitation. It came through the standard diplomatic packet, the kind that the interstellar press collective forwards to credentialed field correspondents when there's an event that qualifies as culturally significant under Clause 14 of the Galactic Transparency Act. I was sitting in the cramped press lounge at Docking Ring 11 on Station Varial, eating a reconstituted noodle bowl and reading through my inbox with all the enthusiasm of a man waiting for a root canal. Most of the packets that morning were the usual noise: trade summit in the outer belt, ribbon cutting on the new hydroponic farm at Proxima Station, a memorial service for the last surviving navigator of the first Vayari diplomatic mission, which was genuinely moving, but not the kind of story my editors were hungry for. And then I saw it. The subject line read, Press Clearance Category 1 Cultural Event, Vampire House Draveth Formal Union Ceremony, Threshold Station, Attendance Window, 72 hours. I read it 3 times. I sat there in the press lounge with noodle soup cooling in my lap, and I read those words 3 times like they were going to change on me if I looked long enough. A vampire wedding. On Threshold Station. I need to give you some context, because if you're reading this in the archive years from now, you might not fully understand what that meant in the spring of 2387. The vampiric houses, and there were 11 of them by then, formally recognized by the Galactic Assembly after the Accords of Verdana, had been part of documented interstellar society for about 60 years. That sounds like a long time. It isn't. Not when you're dealing with a species that measures individual lifespans in centuries. The vampiric houses had existed in the shadows of human civilization for, according to their own historians, somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 years. They'd been watching us build cities and burn them down. They'd been there when we invented the wheel, and when we split the atom, and when we finally cracked faster-than-light travel, and stumbled out into a galaxy that turned out to be more crowded than any of us expected. They came forward during the emergence. That's what historians call it now, the 3-year period after first contact with the Vayari, when a cascade of previously hidden or obscure species essentially decided that with the cat out of the bag, there wasn't much point in staying underground. The vampiric houses were not the strangest thing that came forward during the emergence. They weren't even the most unsettling. But they were, without question, the most dramatic about it. House Draveth in particular. If you know the name, and you probably do, given what happened, then you already know that House Draveth is old money, old power, and old in every sense of the word. Their eldest member, the patriarch, claimed to be 847 years old. Nobody had disputed that claim successfully. They had assets on 6 planets, a legal team that could make a sector court cry, and a reputation for doing things the way they wanted to do them regardless of what anyone else thought. Their formal union ceremonies, the closest equivalent to what humans would call a wedding, happened approximately once every generation among their upper tier, which meant once every 50 to 80 years, and they were legendary for being completely, utterly closed to outsiders. The last one had happened in 2311, before the emergence, before anyone knew what they were. This one was different. This one came with a press clearance. I remember staring at that inbox item for a long time, and I remember the specific, stupid thought that floated through my mind in that moment. This is the story of the decade. I hit the acceptance link, before my noodles had fully cooled. The transport to Threshold Station left from Docking Ring 3 at 1800 hours, and I made it with 4 minutes to spare. I had my recorder clipped to my lapel, my press credentials embedded in my left wrist chip, a change of clothes in a bag that fit in the overhead compartment, and approximately no idea what I was walking into. There were 9 other press people on the transport. I recognized a few of them. Yara Sultan from Galactic Feeds, who was so calm and collected she made me feel like I was vibrating. Marcus Beale from the Assembly Observer, who had covered the emergence extensively and had actually interviewed 2 House representatives before, which made him the closest thing to an expert any of us had. 2 journalists I didn't know who turned out to be from the Vayari Cultural Exchange Program, which surprised me, because I hadn't realized the Vayari were interested in vampiric culture specifically. And a woman named Lena Ad who said she was freelance and didn't offer any further information about herself, which in the press world usually means either spy or extremely private, and I'd learned to treat both with equal caution. Marcus sat across the aisle from me on the transport, and almost immediately started giving me background information in the slightly patronizing way of someone who wants you to know they're better prepared than you. Formal union ceremonies in vampiric culture aren't like human weddings, he said, pulling up notes on his tablet. They're not just about the 2 individuals, they're about houses. They're about lineage alignment, resource pooling, territorial agreements. The ceremony itself is a binding act, legally, culturally, and according to house doctrine, supernaturally. What does supernaturally mean in this context? I asked. Marcus gave me a look. They believe it, that's what it means. Whether it's real or not is above my pay grade. Who's getting married? Bound, he corrected. They call it a binding, not a wedding, and the short answer is we don't know exactly. The press clearance doesn't name the individuals. It just says a formal union between 2 members of House Draveth, which is unusual because normally these announcements are very formal about lineage and title. Why unusual? He paused over his tablet. Because in House Draveth protocol, you announce the lineage publicly as a demonstration of strength. Withholding the names means either they want the element of surprise for some reason, or, he stopped. Or what? Or one of the parties isn't from House Draveth. That landed quietly. We both sat with it for a minute. You mean like an outside alliance, I said. I mean I don't know, Marcus said. And that's what makes this interesting enough for them to open it to press, I think. Whatever is happening at Threshold Station in 36 hours, it's big enough that House Draveth decided visibility was worth more than privacy. I looked out the transport's narrow porthole at the dark between stars and thought about that. Threshold Station is difficult to describe to someone who hasn't been there, and I realize that most people haven't. It exists on the border between what the Assembly calls charted space and the unratified territories, a stretch of dark, unmapped sectors that nobody has officially claimed, and most people avoid for reasons that range from practical to superstitious. The station itself was built about 200 years ago as a neutral refueling point, and it has the kind of layered, sediment architecture that comes from 2 centuries of addition and expansion without any overarching design philosophy. Old sections are dark and low-ceilinged and smell faintly of machine oil. Newer sections are brighter and taller but somehow feel less solid, like they were built in a hurry and nobody is entirely confident they'll hold. House Draveth had purchased a significant portion of the station's central ring about 40 years ago. They called it the Threshold Quarter, and it was, even arriving for the first time, even as someone who had covered war zones, one of the most immediately striking places I had ever been. The lights were different there. That's the first thing I noticed. They used a spectrum that was slightly off from standard galactic assembly station lighting, deeper blues, darker reds, an ambient glow that was warm without being bright. The air was cooler by about 3 degrees. The floors were actual stone, dark basalt tiles imported from somewhere, polished so finely that you could see yourself walking in them. The ceilings were high. The corridors curved in ways that felt intentional, architectural rather than functional. There were art pieces on the walls that I didn't recognize. Not digital, actual physical pieces. Oil paintings and carved panels and tapestries that looked genuinely old. Not reproduction old, but actually, physically old in the way that makes the air around them feel heavier. It felt like walking into another time, without actually leaving your own. Our press group was met by a woman who introduced herself as Sierra, House Dravith Protocol Coordinator. She was tall, dark-haired, dressed in deep burgundy that somehow made her look like she'd stepped out of one of the paintings in the corridor. Her voice was even and low, and she spoke with the precise, unhurried diction that I would come to associate with older members of the houses. The sense that words were not to be rushed, that language was a material thing to be handled carefully. She gave us the rules. No recordings in the ceremony hall itself, audio or visual. Press credentials permitted observation from the designated gallery only. No approach of house members without prior arrangement through the protocol office. No interviews without explicit consent from the subject and confirmation from a house senior representative. Standard galactic diplomatic conduct standards applied, plus a list of additional house-specific protocols that Sierra walked us through with the patience of someone who had done this many times and had low expectations for how well it would be retained. I was writing all of this down in my personal journal. I still used paper, which is an affectation I refuse to apologize for, and I noticed that Lena Ad, the freelancer, was not writing anything down at all. She was watching Sierra with a kind of careful, measuring attention that didn't quite match the behavior of a journalist cataloging logistics. I filed that away. We were shown to our accommodations, small but not uncomfortable, with that same cooler air and deep spectrum lighting, and told that the welcome reception would begin at 2100 hours in the gathering hall of the Threshold Quarter, and that the ceremony itself would take place the following evening, beginning at midnight, lasting until dawn. All night, Marcus asked. Sierra looked at him with the very faintest suggestion of amusement. House ceremonies are not scheduled to human convenience, she said. He nodded. She turned and walked away, and I watched her go and thought, what exactly have I walked into here? The answer, as it turned out, was significantly more complicated than a wedding. But I didn't know that yet at 2100 hours when I walked into the gathering hall of the Threshold Quarter and stopped in the doorway because the room made my brain stop working for a second. It was enormous, far larger than it had any right to be given the external dimensions I'd observed of that section of the station. Ceilings must have been 40 feet high, arched in dark stone, strung with lights that looked like suspended stars, or maybe they were actual lights designed to look that way. I couldn't tell. Long tables draped in black cloth ran the length of the room, set with what appeared to be actual silver, not silver-plated, actual silver, heavy and old-looking. Candles, dozens of them, real flame, not synthetic, which was technically a station safety violation, but apparently House Dravith had arrangements. Flowers that I didn't recognize, deep purple, almost black, extraordinarily beautiful, arranged in tall vases that were also very clearly ancient. And the guests. I want to try to describe what it was like to walk into a room full of vampires, because I don't think any of the reporting I'd read before that night had quite captured it. They didn't all look inhuman. That's the first thing. In fact, many of them looked entirely, unremarkably human. Different ages, different ethnicities, different styles of dress ranging from the elaborate traditional formal wear of older house members to the more contemporary attire of younger generation Dravith. They talked, they gestured, they laughed in small, low ripples of sound across the room. But there was something. I can't make it more specific than that because I've thought about it for months since, and I still can't pin it to one quality. It was a collective quality, the way the room felt, the particular weight of attention that pressed against your awareness when multiple sets of eyes were on you, even briefly. The sense that every person in that room was tracking more information about you than you were tracking about them, and doing it without apparent effort. The other press people felt it too. I could tell by the way we all unconsciously moved slightly closer to each other in the doorway before spreading out into the room. Yara Sultan, to her credit, walked in first with her chin up and her recorder running in her jacket pocket. I walked in second. Lena Ad was directly behind me, and she wasn't leaning toward the group anymore. She'd stopped at the threshold and was scanning the room with that measuring look, and now she had a faint line between her eyebrows that I associated with people calculating exits. I thought, definitely not a freelancer. Then someone handed me a glass of something dark and cold, and I was distracted from that thought for approximately 6 hours, which, in retrospect, was too long. The something dark and cold turned out to be a blackberry and star anise wine from a vineyard on the surface of Crest IV, one of the planets in House Dravith's holdings. It was extraordinary. I don't drink much, or I didn't before that night, but the wine went down like it was meant to be there, like my body had been waiting for it and hadn't told me. I found myself talking to a man named Callum Dravith, third lineage, he said, which I gathered meant he was not in the direct inheritance line but was fully family rather than periphery, who was approximately the age he looked, which was about 45, but who told me without ceremony that he had been born in 2091. He had silver-white hair worn long and tied back, a dark suit that fit in a way that suggested either perfect tailoring or the kind of body that simply holds clothes well, and a sense of calm that was not the calm of someone relaxed, but rather the calm of someone for whom very little in any room was surprising. He seemed genuinely curious about journalism, about the process of it, how I decided what a story was, how I chose what to include and what to leave out, what I thought the responsibility of the journalist was in an era of galactic expansion, where the audience was so vast and so varied that the same story could mean completely different things to a human reader on Earth and a Vayari reader on their home cluster. I could feel myself being charmed in real time, and I was aware enough to note it and not quite aware enough to stop talking. We were in the middle of a conversation about the nature of truth in reporting. He had a genuinely interesting perspective. That truth as humans used it was a temporally bound concept, while the houses experienced time differently and therefore experienced truth differently. When I noticed something across the room, Lena Ad was not at the tables anymore. She had moved to the far side of the room, near one of the heavy draped panels along the back wall, and she was talking to someone. Not the casual circulating talk of a reception, a specific, low, focused conversation with a man I hadn't seen before. He wasn't in house formal attire. He was dressed in something dark and utilitarian that looked like it had been dressed up to look like a suit and wasn't fully succeeding. And they were both watching a specific corner of the room. I followed their eyeline. In the corner, partially obscured by the arrangement of a tall vase and the angle of the hanging lights, two figures were having what appeared to be a quiet but very intense conversation. One of them I recognized, Sira, the protocol coordinator. The other was a young woman, clearly Dravith by her bearing and the detail of her formal dress, but something about her posture was wrong in a way I couldn't immediately name. Too tense, too still. The stillness of someone holding themselves together by concentration rather than peace. Callum noticed the direction of my gaze and his expression shifted, just slightly, just enough. "Do you know who that is?" I asked, keeping my voice low and conversational. In the corner, the young woman with Sira. He was quiet for a moment that was a beat too long. "That is Myra Dravith," he said finally, "first lineage." I understood the weight of that. First lineage meant direct heir. First lineage meant she was close to the house's center of gravity in a way that third lineage like Callum was not. "Is she?" I started. "She is one of the principals of tomorrow's ceremony," Callum said, and his voice had shifted too, not colder, exactly, but more careful. The charm was still there, but the ease behind it had adjusted slightly, like someone had turned a dial. She is being bound. She doesn't look happy about it, I said. The beat of silence was longer this time. She is being bound to fulfill a treaty obligation, Callum said, and the careful quality in his voice was now very audible. There is a distinction between obligation and happiness, as I think you probably understand. I looked at him. He met my eyes, and there was something there, something beneath the calm, beneath the centuries of practice at revealing exactly what he chose to reveal, that I can only describe as concern. The kind of concern that someone tries to fold away so it doesn't show. Who is she being bound to? I asked. He lifted his glass and looked away from me and said, "That is a question for tomorrow's ceremony." And then Sira materialized at his elbow and said, very quietly, that dinner was being served, and Callum moved away with her, and I stood there with my dark wine feeling the cold air of the threshold quarter, and thinking about the look on a young woman's face across a very beautiful, very strange room. I didn't sleep much that night. Partly it was the wine, not in the way that makes you sleep too much, but in the way that keeps your thoughts too bright. Partly it was the station sounds, which in the threshold quarter were different from the standard hum and circulation noise of a working station. Quieter. Occasionally there were low vibrations that I couldn't identify, rhythmic and deep, coming from somewhere below the floor level. I told myself it was engineering. I wasn't fully convinced. Mostly it was Myra Draveth's face in that corner. I'd covered enough forced situations, enough political arrangements, enough diplomatic theater where one or more participants were there under pressure rather than preference, to recognize what I'd seen. And I'd also covered enough situations where the people involved didn't want interference, where the story was genuinely not mine to tell, to understand the complexity. But there was something else, something I couldn't name yet. I lay in the narrow accommodations bunk and stared at the ceiling and went over the evening methodically, which is a habit. The room, the guests, the wine, Callum, Lena and her contact near the draped wall, the corner, Myra, Sira's expression when she'd appeared at Callum's elbow, which, now that I was replaying it, had not been the neutral protocol expression of a staff member managing the evening. It had been something else, something tighter. Urgency. She had moved Callum away from me with urgency. I turned that over for a while. Then I sat up, turned on the small reading light and opened my journal, and I wrote down everything I'd observed. All of it. Names, times, body language, the precise quality of the silences. This is what I always do when a situation doesn't add up yet. You put what you know on paper and you let the gaps show themselves, because gaps are the story. The gap that showed itself most clearly when I read back over my notes was this. House Draveth had invited press coverage to a ceremony that was, by their own centuries of tradition, private. They had done it by claiming cultural significance under Galactic Transparency Act protections, but they had not named the principals. They had not released any information about the nature of the treaty the ceremony would fulfill. And the one person I had managed to identify as a principal, Myra Draveth, first lineage, had looked like someone standing at the edge of something she had not chosen. I wrote a question in the margin of my notes, who benefits from witnesses? And then below it another one, whose idea was the press clearance. I didn't have answers yet, but something was forming, the shape of something. I set down the journal and looked at the time on the small screen by the bunk. 3:40 hours. The ceremony began in 20 hours. I thought, I need to talk to Lena Ad. Part 2, the things nobody told us. I found Lena Ad the next morning in the small common area adjacent to the press accommodations wing, sitting alone with a cup of something hot and a posture that was alert despite the early hour and the relative quiet of the space. She had her back to the wall. She faced the entrance. Both of these things registered before I'd even sat down. She watched me approach without expression, not hostile, not warm, calibrating. I put my coffee on the table and sat down across from her and said, "You're not press." She looked at me for a moment, then she said, "No." "Assembly," I guessed. A pause adjacent, which was the careful way of saying she was connected to the Galactic Assembly without being direct service, contracted, affiliated, or working through one of the Assembly's many auxiliary structures. Intelligence adjacent was the most likely interpretation. "Okay," I said, "then you already know more about what's happening here than I do." "Probably. And you're going to tell me none of it." She wrapped both hands around her cup and looked at me steadily. She had dark eyes that I noticed in the morning light were not entirely the flat dark they'd appeared the previous night. There was depth to them that I'd initially attributed to the low-spectrum lighting of the threshold quarter and now thought might just be her. "I'm going to tell you that this is a significantly more complex situation than the press clearance suggested," she said. "And I'm going to strongly recommend that you observe tonight's ceremony from exactly the location you've been assigned in the designated press gallery, and do not attempt to move from it under any circumstances." "That sounds like a warning." "It is a warning." "For what?" She was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone who doesn't want to answer, but the silence of someone deciding how much of an answer to give. "The press clearance," she said finally, "was not issued by House Draveth." I set down my coffee. "What?" "It was issued in House Draveth's name, formatted correctly, credentialed correctly, passed through the right channels, but it originated from outside the House." I was very still. "Who?" "That's what I'm here to determine," she said. "And before you ask the obvious follow-up, no, I don't yet know the full purpose. But the working theory is that someone wanted witnesses here tonight. Someone who is not a member of House Draveth and is not acting in House Draveth's interest." The margin note from my journal last night surfaced immediately. "Who benefits from witnesses?" "Myra Draveth," I said. Lena's expression shifted fractionally. "What about her?" "I saw her last night. She's one of the principals. She looked like she was under duress." I watched Lena's face carefully. "Was she the one who filed the press clearance?" A longer pause. "She is first lineage. She would not have the channels to—" Lena stopped. "She's not acting alone," she said, and the phrasing was careful in a way that told me she was saying exactly as much as she decided to say and not one word more. "So someone is helping her," I said. "Someone filed the clearance to get witnesses into the ceremony. Because if press is here, if the Galactic Assembly has observers present, then whatever happens in that ceremony is on record." Lena looked at me with an expression that was the closest she'd come to anything I could read as approval. "You're not as distracted by the setting as your colleagues," she said. "The wine was very good," I admitted, "but I don't stop paying attention when something's good." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What I'm telling you is strictly advisory. I have no authority over your movements or your choices as a credentialed press representative. But I want you to understand, the people involved in manufacturing this situation are not small players. If this evening goes the way the worst-case scenario suggests it might, the gallery is going to be the safest position in the building. And if it goes the other way, then it's going to be a very beautiful ceremony," she said, and picked up her cup again. I thought about it for a while. Then I said, "The man you were talking to last night near the back wall, the one who wasn't dressed like a guest." She didn't answer. "Is he assembly too?" Still nothing. "Or is he House Draveth loyal?" I said, "and he's the one who told you the clearance was external." She stood up, finished her cup, and looked at me with that calibrating expression. "I have a meeting in 20 minutes, she said. "Please stay in the gallery tonight, Mr. Okafor." She walked out. I sat there with my coffee and listened to the quiet deep hum from somewhere below the floor and thought about witness and record and the specific quality of urgency in Sierra's face when she'd moved Callum away from my questions the previous night. The day before the ceremony was structured around a series of pre-binding observances that we were permitted to view from the designated gallery, a second-level walkway above the gathering hall that had been opened up and furnished with chairs and small monitoring stations so that the press group could observe without interfering with the proceedings below. The observances were not what I expected. I don't know exactly what I expected. Something with more theater, maybe, more explicit ritual drama. What I watched for 3 hours in the morning was something quieter and stranger than that. Members of House Dravith, moving through the gathering hall in specific formations that I didn't understand but which had clearly choreographed precision, handling objects, old ones, by the look of them, and speaking in what Marcus Beale next to me confirmed was Old Dravith, a language the houses had maintained internally for centuries that had no living speakers outside their walls. "What are they saying?" I asked. "My understanding is limited," Marcus admitted, pulling up references on his tablet. "But this part of the pre-binding observance is called the speaking of what was. It's an accounting, a formal declaration of lineage history for both parties coming into the binding. It's supposed to establish the full weight of what's being aligned. Can you see Myra Dravith?" He scanned the hall below. Third formation on the left, dark blue dress. I found her. She was moving with the formation, all the right gestures, all the right positions. From the gallery, 20 feet above, you could not see her face clearly enough to read it, but her movements were too careful. There's a difference between precision and deliberateness, and what I was watching was someone performing precision while every muscle was tensed toward something else. Yara Solton was recording audio of the observance. The two Vayari journalists were watching with the focused intensity that I'd learned meant they were experiencing something significant by their own cultural framework. The Vayari had a deep philosophical interest in ritual as information transfer, and I suspected they were reading things in the formations that I was missing entirely. At 1400 hours, the pre-ceremony observances paused, and we were given a 2-hour break. I used the break to do something I probably should have done before leaving for the station. I filed a data request with the Assembly's Public Records Division for any diplomatic communications involving House Dravith in the previous 18 months. The request would take time to process, and I wouldn't have the results before the ceremony, but I wanted it on record that I'd asked. Then I went looking for Callum Dravith. He wasn't hard to find. He was in a smaller, quieter corridor off the main threshold quarter promenade, sitting on a bench that had the look of something genuinely old, dark wood, carved detail, and reading a physical book. Not a tablet, a book, bound, paged, the whole thing. I sat down at the other end of the bench. He looked up at me with a calm that was slightly different from the previous night's charm. "You came to ask more questions," he said. "It wasn't a question." "I came because something is wrong here, and I think you know what it is," I said. He closed the book carefully and set it on his knee. "Correspondents ask a great many questions," he said. "It's in the nature of the work." "I'm asking this one specifically," I said. "Not for the story. I'm asking as," I paused, "as a person in this building who would like to understand the actual situation." The calm held for a moment. Then something shifted in it, not breaking, but adjusting, the way a still pool adjusts when something small falls into it. "What do you know," he said very quietly, "about the Valdrath Accord?" I shook my head. "Nothing." He was quiet for a moment, as if weighing something. "The Valdrath Accord was a territorial agreement signed in 2351, he said, between House Dravith and the Valdrath Collective, a galactic assembly-affiliated political body that controls resource extraction, rights in a significant section of the unratified territories. You'll note that this station sits on the border of those territories." I noted that. The Accord granted the Valdrath Collective certain extraction concessions, in exchange for recognizing House Dravith legal standing under the Galactic Assembly's emerging framework for non-human species governance. It was one of the first formal agreements between a vampiric house and an assembly-affiliated body. It was, at the time, considered significant. "What's in the unratified territories worth extracting?" I asked. "More than I'll tell you today," he said. "But you can research it when you're home. What matters for your current situation is the secondary clause of the accord." He paused. The secondary clause stipulated that in the event of a formal political alignment, meaning a binding ceremony, between House Dravith and a member of a species or group that held competing claims in the unratified territories, the Valdrath Collective retained the right to contest the accord itself. I let that settle. So if Myra Dravith is being bound to someone who holds competing claims, then the Valdrath Accord becomes potentially void, Callum said quietly, and the extraction rights become contested. And the Valdrath Collective, which has invested significantly in those rights over 36 years, would suffer a catastrophic loss. "Who is she being bound to?" I asked again. This time he answered. "His name is Evander Solace," Callum said. "He is, by human classification, a hybrid. His mother was human. His father was the senior representative of a species that I will not name specifically because naming it would be a significant political act, and I am not prepared to make that statement on record. What I will tell you is that his father's people have claimed sovereignty over portions of the unratified territories since before the Galactic Assembly existed." I understood then. So the binding voids the accord. If the Valdrath Collective acknowledges it, yes. And if they don't? He picked up his book again, an action that in a human would have signaled the conversation ending, but in him felt more like a punctuation, a breath. Then we would be in a very different situation. "Callum," I waited until he looked at me. "Does Myra Dravith want this binding?" The still pool quality again, something moving in it. "Evander Solace is," he stopped, started again. "They have known each other for 8 years. She has a great deal of feeling for him as I understand the situation." "That's not what I asked." "No," he said, "it is not." He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the deep hum from below the station floor came into my awareness again, and I found myself listening to it, wondering about it, before he spoke again. "Myra Dravith is first lineage," he said. "Her binding is the patriarch's arrangement to make. She was informed of the decision 4 months ago. The binding fulfills a secondary alliance that the patriarch has been negotiating with Evander's father's people for several decades." "So she is not opposed to the binding," Callum said carefully. "She cares for Evander. She would choose him. But the choice was made for her before she knew the choice was being made, and there is a difference between a door you walk through willingly and a door that opens whether you walk or not." I sat with that. "And the press clearance," I said, "did she arrange for it?" He opened his book to the page he'd been reading. "I think," he said, in a voice that was nearly too quiet to hear, "that someone who loves her wanted witnesses to the moment she stops having the right to choose." He started reading again. I got up and left him there on the old wooden bench and walked back toward the press accommodations with a weight in my chest that was part story and part something older and less nameable than journalism. Part 3, Midnight Beginning. The ceremony began at precisely midnight, because of course it did. We were in the gallery by 23:30, all 10 of us. Even Lena Add, who had changed into something darker than what she'd worn the previous evening, and had a small device clipped to her belt that I was fairly certain was not a recorder. She positioned herself at the far end of the gallery closest to the exit stairs, and I noted this without being obvious about it. The gathering hall below us had been transformed since the morning's observances. The long tables were gone. The space was open, enormous in a way that felt even more accentuated by the emptiness, and lined along both walls with House Dravith members in formal standing positions. Not sitting, standing. This was a ceremony where you stood. The lighting had changed again, deeper. More of that suspended star quality, but denser now, concentrated in a central path down the length of the hall from the entrance to the far end, where a structure had been placed. I don't know what to call it. Altar feels like the wrong word, but it was a raised platform with two standing positions marked in what appeared to be actual light, two columns of soft blue-white that rose from floor to ceiling and held their shape without any visible source. There were guests I hadn't seen at the reception. Not press, they were in the gallery, house members, older ones, people who had the quality of deep age that Callum had but amplified, concentrated. The room's particular weight of attention that I'd noticed at the reception was now significantly more intense. Being in the gallery above it rather than standing in the hall itself was, I realized, exactly the right place for someone without centuries of practice at existing in the same space as that level of accumulated presence. At exactly midnight, music began. I can't fully describe it. It was not human music, and it was not any galactic form I recognized. It was produced by instruments that I couldn't see from the gallery, low, resonant, with a tonal range that seemed to go below sound into something you felt in the chest and behind the eyes. It was not unpleasant. It was enormously, overwhelmingly affecting in a way that was hard to separate from the physical response it produced, which was something between awe and grief, and the specific feeling you get at the edge of something very large and very irreversible. Yara Solton, next to me, pressed her lips together and said nothing, and I could see from her profile that she was feeling it too. The entrance at the far end of the hall opened. Evander Salas walked in first. I had no photograph of him, no record, nothing to prepare me for the visual reality of him. He was tall, very tall, over 6 feet, with the kind of build that was not performance or cultivation, but just the fact of him. His coloring was unusual in a way that my brain filed initially as exotic, and then understood, was the visible indication of what Callum had said, both human and not. The particular combination of his parents visible in the angles of his face and the quality of his eyes, which were silver-white in a way that was striking even from the gallery and clearly not entirely human in their quality. He wore black. Very simple, very well made. No ornamentation except a single mark on his left hand that I couldn't see clearly enough to identify, but that seemed to be the source of a faint luminescence. He walked slowly, with the particular kind of controlled calm that I recognized not as peace, but as someone holding a great deal very still. He stopped at the platform, stood at one of the 2 marked positions, and faced the entrance. He waited. Marcus was whispering something into his recorder beside me. The 2 Vayari journalists were very still. I was breathing carefully and watching. The entrance opened again. Myra Dravith. She was in white, not exactly white, something with depth to it, like white seen through water, and her dark hair was up in an arrangement that I had no doubt had taken hours and several people. She moved with the same precision I'd watched that morning in the pre-ceremony observances, and from the gallery I still couldn't read her face with complete certainty. Except for the first 3 seconds, when she stepped into the hall and her eyes found Evander at the platform, something crossed her face that was not performance and was not precision. It lasted about 3 seconds before she reassembled it into the formal expression the moment required. But I'd been watching faces in high-stakes situation for 11 years. What I saw in those 3 seconds was love. Complicated, troubled, deeply felt love, the kind that has years and history and difficulty behind it, not a ceremony-produced emotion, something she'd been carrying in before she walked through the door. And following about 6 steps behind her, moving with the unhurried certainty of someone who had built the world this ceremony was happening in, the patriarch of House Dravith. He was not the oldest-looking person in the room. He didn't have the visual drama that film and popular culture had led me to expect from something called a patriarch. He was medium height, silver-haired, dressed in the deep formal colors of the house, and he walked with the kind of weight that is not physical but experiential, the compressed gravity of someone who has been making decisions that shaped other people's lives for 800 years. His face was still. Not the still of peace or the still of performance. The still of someone who has arrived at a conclusion and is walking through the remaining formalities. He saw me looking, or seemed to, from the gallery 20 feet above in the press section. He looked up and his eyes passed over the gallery, and for approximately half a second they held on my position, and the weight of them was something I felt in a way I cannot fully explain except to say that I did not look away. And I have excellent instincts about when to look away, because looking away felt like it would mean something I wasn't ready to concede. Then his eyes moved on, and he continued down the center of the hall, and I exhaled. The ceremony lasted 6 hours. I can tell you the sequence of it, but I cannot tell you I fully understood it. The music continued in shifting registers. The old Dravith language moved through the hall in voices that were resonant in the same way the music was, not loud, but physically present, entering the body rather than simply the ears. There were elements that Marcus was able to identify from his research. The speaking of names, which was apparently the official announcement of who was being bound, and to whom, and which caused a very subtle but perceptible shift in the gathered house members when Evander's lineage was named, the kind of shift that is people collectively absorbing information that is significant. The blood accord, which was a physical gesture between the two principles that I'll decline to describe in clinical detail, but which involved both of them and left Myra's right hand and Evander's left both bearing the same faint luminescence I'd noted on his hand when he walked in. The patriarch spoke for 40 minutes in Old Dravith, without a pause or a change in expression. At one point, somewhere around the 3rd hour, Myra's posture changed. I was watching for it specifically, and I caught it, not dramatic, not a breakdown, just a subtle release of something she'd been holding, like a breath let out very slowly. Her shoulders dropped by approximately half an inch. Her chin came up. She was looking at Evander with an expression that I can only describe as resolved, not resigned, which is different, resolved. The expression of someone who has made peace with a decision not by stopping wanting something else, but by choosing this thing anyway. Evander was looking back at her, with something that made the air between them feel different from 20 feet up. And then, in the 5th hour, shortly before dawn began to lighten the artificial windows in the upper part of the hall, something happened that I had not expected, and Lena apparently had. The doors at the far end of the hall, the ones we'd come through from the outer station, opened. Not with ceremony, not as part of the proceedings. They opened because people pushed them open from the outside. There were 12 of them. They came in through the main doors and 4 more through side access points that I hadn't noticed before but which clearly existed, and which clearly someone had mapped. They were dressed in the uniform of the Valdrath Collective Security Division, dark gray, gold insignia, the kind of body armor that said this was not a symbolic visit. They were carrying weapons, not drawn, not pointed, but present, the kind of armed entry that occupies the middle space between declaration and confrontation, where the violence is implied rather than deployed, and the effect is that everyone in the room understands the violence is available. The gathering hall went silent. The music stopped, not gradually stopped as if cut. The lead Valdrath officer, I didn't know her rank, but she moved like authority and spoke like someone who had rehearsed this, stepped to the center of the hall and announced, in galactic standard, that the ceremony was in violation of Clause 7 of the Valdrath Accord, that House Dravith was hereby notified of a formal contest of the binding under terms of the treaty, and that by order of the Valdrath Collective Council, proceedings were to be immediately suspended pending adjudication. She said all of this into a hall full of vampires at 5 in the morning. And the hall received it in absolute silence. I was watching the patriarch. His expression had not moved a single millimeter from the position it had held for the last 6 hours. I was watching Myra. She had turned to face the officer with the posture of someone who had been told this might happen, and had not enjoyed being told, but had prepared anyway. And I was watching Lena Ad, who had her hand near the device on her belt, and was watching the 4 Valdrath officers at the side entrance near her position, with the concentration of someone who has run threat assessments on multiple scenarios, and is now running the most relevant one in real time. I made a professional decision. I activated my personal recorder. Not the press standard one on my lapel, which had been restricted per Sierra's briefing, the other one. The small one I've been carrying in the inner pocket of every jacket I've owned since my first war assignment, because I am a careful person and careful people have backup plans. I activated it and let it run, and I did not look away from anything. What happened in the next 47 minutes was one of the most extraordinary things I have witnessed in 11 years of extraordinary witnessing. The patriarch of House Draveth spoke. He spoke in galactic standard, which was notable. The ceremony had been conducted entirely in Old Draveth, and the switch to standard was itself an act, a deliberate broadening of the audience, an acknowledgement that what was being said was intended for ears beyond the house. He said that the Valdrath Collective Security Division's presence in the gathering hall of the Threshold Quarter was a violation of the same Valdrath Accord they were citing, because Clause 12 of that accord guaranteed the sovereignty of Draveth-held territory during formal House proceedings. He said this without raising his voice, without moving from his position at the platform. He then turned to Myra and Evander, who were still standing at their marked positions in those columns of blue-white light, and he continued the ceremony. The lead Valdrath officer told him, with increasing tension in her voice, to stop. He did not stop. She deployed 2 of her officers toward the platform. They moved with the practiced efficiency of people who did this professionally. They stopped approximately 6 feet from the platform and didn't go further. I don't know exactly what happened in those 6 feet. I know what I saw, which was a very rapid shift in the quality of the attention being directed at those 2 officers from the assembled House Draveth members lining the walls, and I know that the officers felt it because they stopped, and they looked at each other, and neither of them moved forward. Nobody touched them, nobody threatened them verbally. The patriarch didn't pause in what he was saying. The officers stopped and didn't go further, and eventually they stepped back. The lead Valdrath officer shifted approach. She raised her device. It was a communication unit, not a weapon, though the initial raising of it had made half the gallery flinch, and began a broadcast. She was filing the formal contest in real time, transmitting to the Valdrath Collective Council, creating the legal record. And here is where the press clearance made sense. Here is where the whole architecture of the evening resolved into meaning. Lena Ad spoke. She said, clearly and formally and loud enough for the hall to hear, "This proceeding is observed by a verified representative of the Galactic Assembly Oversight Division, Clause 9 Observer Status, on record as of this moment. All actions, statements and filings are hereby subject to Assembly review under the Galactic Transparency Act." The Valdrath officer looked at her. Lena said, "Your contest filing is noted. The ceremony's completion is also noted. Under Assembly protocol, neither action supersedes the other pending adjudication. However, your presence here, armed in sovereign Draveth territory during a protected cultural proceeding, is also on record." A very long silence. And Lena added, "So is the record of who issued the press clearance, and who filed the protest, and the timeline of both." The Valdreth officer's jaw was very tight. She lowered her communication device. She looked at the patriarch, who had not stopped speaking and had not looked at her. Then she made a signal to her people and they withdrew, all of them, through the doors they'd come in, which closed behind them. The hall held the silence for a moment that felt like it had weight and texture. And then the patriarch completed the speaking of the bond, and the two columns of light shifted, merged, held for a moment at a quality that I cannot describe technically, but which everyone in that hall, everyone in the gallery, felt in the particular place in the chest where irreversible things register. And then it was done. Part 4. After the lights. Dawn came through the artificial windows of the gathering hall in the specific way that designed sunrise does, slightly too perfect, the colors a little more saturated than actual atmosphere produces. It didn't matter. The light in the room was already different from what it had been at midnight, changed by something that was not the windows. Myra Draveth and Evander Solis were standing with their bound hands between them, and she was looking up at him, and his face was, I struggled for the word, and settled on undone. Undone in the way of someone who has been braced for impact for a long time, and is only now in the moment after understanding that the impact has passed. She said something to him that I couldn't hear from the gallery. Whatever it was made him close his eyes briefly in the way of someone receiving something they'd needed. I realized I had stopped writing. My recorder was running and my journal was open on my knee, and I had stopped writing and was just watching. And I had to make a deliberate choice to start writing again, because this was my job, and the not writing was a self-indulgence I couldn't afford. I wrote, ceremony complete at approximately 6:12 hours. Valdreth intervention documented. Assembly observer intervention documented. Binding completed. Then I stopped and added in smaller letters. She chose it anyway. Lena Ad found me in the corridor outside the hall about 20 minutes later, while the post-ceremony proceedings were happening inside. She had that measuring look in place, but there was something different behind it now. Not relaxed, exactly, but settled. The particular quality of someone who has run the scenario they were worried about, and has the result. You recorded it, she said. I did. The press restriction applied to the press standard equipment, I said, which I wasn't using. She looked at me for a moment. That's going to be a legal question. Probably, I agreed. But right now I have a record of what happened in that hall tonight, and you're an assembly observer, which means everything in that room was already going on official record the moment you declared it. She considered this. The Valdreth Collective is going to challenge the binding. I know. It'll be a multi-year adjudication process. I know, I said, but it'll happen in the open because of tonight. Because it's on record. Because someone wanted witnesses, she said. I nodded. Who filed the press clearance? Another measuring pause. A third-party communications firm. We've traced it through 2 intermediaries. We believe the origin was Evander Solis's legal team. I thought about Callum Draveth on his bench in the corridor with his old book. Someone who loves her wanted witnesses. Can I quote you on any of this? I asked. No, Lena said. But you can file your recording with the Assembly Archive as independent observer documentation, and I will confirm receipt. That's nearly the same thing. Nearly, she said, and for the first time in 2 days she almost smiled. I stayed on Threshold Station for another 36 hours. Standard post-event debrief with the press group, filing preliminary copy with the collective. An assembly records request in follow-up to the one I'd filed the previous day. On the last morning, I walked through the threshold quarter one more time early, before most people were moving through it. That same deep cool, the blue-red lighting, the ancient art on the walls. I stopped in front of one of the oil paintings near the corridor that led to the accommodations wing. It was a portrait A woman in formal house attire, dark-haired, with the same specific quality of stillness that I'd seen in multiple faces over the previous 2 days, but most clearly in Myra's when she'd walked into the hall at midnight. The painting looked very old. The placard beside it identified the subject as Myra, House Draveth, 5th lineage, and gave a date of 1847, which meant this painting was over 500 years old and depicted a woman named Myra who had been bound in a ceremony that, given the century, had certainly not been her choice in any meaningful sense. I stood there for a while. 500 years, the painting on the wall, the ceremony last night, the specific difference between what the woman in the 1847 painting had experienced and what I had watched Myra Draveth choose in her own complicated way, in the space between what was arranged for her and what she carried into the hall to walk into. It wasn't a solved problem. I want to be clear about that. The Valdreth Accord challenge was real. The adjudication process was going to be brutal and long. The patriarch had arranged this, and arrangements are not choices, and the difference between them matters enormously. And I had spent most of the past 36 hours arguing with myself about what the truth of the situation was, and not arriving at a clean answer. But I thought about the 3 seconds when she'd walked through the door, the thing that crossed her face before she assembled it, the drop of her shoulders in the 3rd hour when something was released, Evander's expression when it was done. The painter of the 1847 portrait could not have known what would happen 500 years later in this same building. Nobody can know that, but time does something, I think. Slowly and at cost, and not without a lot of things being wrong in the middle, but it does something. I took out my journal and wrote, I never meant to attend a vampire wedding. And then, but I'm glad someone made sure there were witnesses. I left on the 900 transport back to Station Varial. Marcus Beale fell asleep before we cleared the docking ring. The 2 Vayari journalists were talking quietly in their own language, and I thought from their tone they were processing the ceremonial structure in reference to their own philosophical frameworks, which I hoped they'd publish because I would read it. I looked out the porthole at Threshold Station growing smaller behind us, and the dark beyond it, and the unratified territories in that darkness that everyone had claims on, and thought about what is owned and what is chosen, and what it means to stand in a room and be a witness. My recorder was still running. I let it run. 3 weeks later, the Valdreth Collective filed its formal challenge with the Galactic Assembly Court of Accord. The filing cited the binding ceremony as a violation of the treaty's secondary clause and requested immediate suspension of House Draveth's territorial recognition in the contested section of the unratified territories. House Draveth filed a counter-challenge 17 hours later. Their legal team, which was, by any measure, extraordinary, cited 12 specific points of Assembly protocol. The observer status of the Galactic Assembly representative present at the ceremony, the sovereignty violation committed by the armed entry into Draveth territory, and the complete independent documentation of all events by a credentialed press representative operating under the Galactic Transparency Act. That last part was me. My recording from the gathering hall became one of the key pieces of independent documentation in the case. I was interviewed by the Assembly Court twice. My preliminary article, filed with the Interstellar Press Collective under the headline Witnessed, How One Vampire Wedding Became a Galactic Flashpoint, ran in 3 major galactic publications and was translated into 11 languages including 2 Vayari dialects. The adjudication is ongoing. These things take years. But the binding holds. That's the legal status as of my last update on the case. The binding completed before the challenge was filed, in the presence of an Assembly observer, documented independently by press, and under the protection of the sovereignty clause the Valdreth Collective's own accord established. It holds. I think about Myra Draveth sometimes. I wonder how she's doing, in the specific, personal way that you wonder about someone whose most significant moment you witnessed from 20 feet above and couldn't ask about afterward. I wonder if she knows that her binding is still a legal flashpoint, a contested piece of galactic treaty architecture, a document case that second-year assembly law students are apparently already writing papers on. I wonder if she'd care, given what I saw in those 3 seconds when she walked through the door. Probably not.